Our first thread is titled "Movies While Pregnant Safe?" I was going to see the new Top Gun movie tonight with my family, and my mum started freaking out about the loud sound and being pregnant. I've never heard this before. Is that a thing? Not safe to go to the movies while pregnant because of the loud noise? I couldn't find much online about it. Now, there are kind of two aspects to this particular thread. The first one is the sheer level of fear and anxiety around pregnancy, doing things while you're pregnant. Basically, everything isn't really safe for your baby. And then there are some people who say, hey, you shouldn't walk too much. Other people will say you should walk extra much because both are good for your baby, etc., etc. So we definitely don't really have a great understanding of what the ideal pregnancy looks like. And it's also important to bear in mind that the ideal pregnancy is going to be very different from woman to woman based on her circumstances, based on her physiology, based on her needs, based on how she's handling the pregnancy, based on her baby, and so on and so forth. That's one aspect to it where you kind of read this thread and go, that's a bit nuts, right? Movies, really? That can't be that dangerous. And then there's another part of it, which is actually like there's a sliver of truth to it, in that loud noises while you're pregnant are not very good for you. But I don't think that we have a very good understanding of what constitutes a loud noise, at least as far as I understand it. And I may be completely wrong. So that I guess do your own research and talk to your own doctors before you make any decisions based on anything that I say. But as far as I'm concerned, loud noises are a thing that you would want to avoid under certain circumstances. And one of those circumstances would be, for example, if it's a consistent loud noise, it's happening all the time. For example, if your house is basically a building site and there's drills, you're drilling holes into walls all day long, then eventually there's a point at which your body just does not like being surrounded by loud noise. It gets a bit scary, your stress levels go up, your stress hormones will rise, and so on. And that's not a good situation to be in as a pregnant mother. And so as an example, if you're one of those people who works, for example, in a factory or surrounded by loud machinery, you can hear something like a jackhammer, and a jackhammer is, the noise of a jackhammer really, really gets to you. Then that's not a safe, healthy, ideal environment for a pregnant woman. And that kind of makes sense. And then there's like in between situations where you look at things like maybe concerts, and depending on the type of concert, depending on how close you are to the stage, depending on where you are in relation to the sound boxes, it could be a pretty stressful experience for a fetus and for you, or it could not be. It really depends on how used you are to concerts, how big of a change it is for you, and exactly what type of music is being played there and how loud that is when it's next to you. And then you come to movies, which are yet another kind of end of the spectrum. And the amount of fear that people have associated with it, and quite how much of that fear is also passed down from the older generations. I'm very, very curious how much of that is instinctive versus how much of that is learned. So, for example, to what extent is it that her mother was told when she was pregnant that she shouldn't be around loud noises, and now she's pushing that on her daughter, versus she just instinctively thinks, hey, if I were to imagine being at a cinema and hearing, especially a movie like Top Gun, where there's things like gunfire, and I hear that noise, then that doesn't sit right with me. And then obviously there's a lot to say in terms of the type of delivery and how you approach it. With a pregnant mother, I think there's a tendency to try and go maximum fear as quickly as possible, where you're like, oh my God, how could you do this? This is terrible. You shouldn't do that. And it's all very absolute. And so all of that kind of goes into this question and where it comes from. And ironically, quite a lot of the responses are people going, that's not a thing. This is super weird. What the hell? Which is fair enough. That's my knee-jerk response to it as well. It's kind of like, really? I don't believe it. But I do think that it's based on a fear that does kind of make sense in terms of, as a pregnant woman, you don't want to be working or surrounded by extremely loud noises for a long time. And by extremely loud, I do mean loud enough that it would damage your ears if you were walking around without protection, because that's clearly beyond what your body's capable of handling, of course. So if I were OP, I would go to the movies and I would have a good time, and I would probably not bother talking to my mom about how she should maybe not fearmonger quite so intensely. And there are better ways to express your concerns if you have them. But, if it was a repetitive thing, if it happened over and over and over again, if it happened often enough that I had to say, hey, look, okay, I'm perfectly capable of looking after my own health. I don't need your advice or your tips for that. Then I probably would do it. Until then, I would just roll my eyes and let it go, because it's better to let things go than to choose to die on every hill. Some of the comments, first person says, I'm not sure, but I'm going to see it as well. And the next person says, I don't mean to sound rude or anything, but why on earth would there be anything wrong with loud noises while you're pregnant? Of course you can go to the movies. It's not a thing. I'm going to skip a couple of other people because they will pretty much say the same thing. And then there's this one person who says, I have never heard that it is a safety health issue for baby, but I went to see the new Fantastic Beasts movie when it came out a couple of months ago, and I felt really overwhelmed by the sound during the previews and trailers. I'm sure it didn't actually do the baby any harm, but it just seemed so loud to me that I got really upset and started crying. It didn't feel right, and it made me worry about my baby. I had to leave for a while to calm myself down, but I eventually decided to go back in and finish the movie. The previews are horrifically loud, way louder than the actual movie. I never noticed that before, but Googled it, and apparently that is a thing. I might recommend taking some extra time to get your popcorn, etc., and skipping the previews. I've decided not to go back to the theater until after the baby comes personally, but I don't think you need to be concerned about going as long as you feel comfortable. If you start to feel uncomfortable, you can always go to the restroom and take some deep breaths. I think this is a pretty good thing to keep in mind in general while you're pregnant. Basically, use your own experience and make your own mind up, and you can tell if you're uncomfortable with a particular scenario and why you might be uncomfortable with a particular scenario. If you're just sitting there and you can really tell that there's a response in your body that is ringing some bells where you're like, okay, this feels like a little bit of a red flag, then you can always take a step back and go, okay, you know what, I'm not cool with that. And honestly, I think that that's a much more reliable measure than the vast majority of advice that you'll get, not only from parents or from colleagues or from every other parent that's in your vicinity, but also from your doctor sometimes, because sometimes I will give you really banal advice that's there for everyone, that's in theory meant to be applicable for everyone, but that doesn't take into consideration your own individual circumstances, and that's quite dodgy. So in general, think for your own self, make your own decisions. I find this a little bit of an amusing comment. Older generations have such wild notions. I've heard some crazy things while pregnant, but I went to the movies and was fine. Baby seemed to sleep the whole time. My only problem was getting comfortable for a 2-hour movie being pregnant. So in general, yes, older generations do have pretty different perspectives on being pregnant, on what's okay while you're pregnant and what's not okay while you're pregnant. And I do think that is largely down to people just having different experiences and different things being the norm and acceptable at different times. So I think every generation kind of has their own quirks when it comes to that. You can go to the movies while you're pregnant, but maybe just pay a little bit of attention to how you feel and how your body reacts to it.